There's a number of things on my wish list for Birmingham, particularly when it comes to my portfolio, which is homes and neighbourhoods. So I look after housing, homelessness, bereavement services, localism and registrations. But in the context of housing, I think the first thing on my wish list would be for the government to change the financial model when it comes to building social housing. Birmingham is the biggest council house builder in the country, and still we are not able to build as many properties we would like to meet the demand that we're currently seeing. So that'll be one of the things on my wish list, to make it more easier for us to build social housing. On my wish list, I would also like to see more powers given to local authorities when it comes to things such as exempt accommodation, planning. You know, I think they need to give us some more trust to local authorities to enable us to give the best of the city. We're here on the ground, we know it well. So I think the legislation needs to support us in our aims. And I think the final thing, because I'm being quite greedy, would definitely be around homelessness. So my asks of the government around homelessness would be, firstly, to move from a crisis position into a prevention style, because we all know that if you keep investing in crisis, the likelihood is you keep getting crisis. You invest in prevention, then the likelihood that is what you're going to get. And at the moment, we get lots of investment into crisis rather than trying to get upstream. And in that, I would ask for a little bit of systemic change when it comes to policies, because sometimes people think that it's, whilst local authorities do need more funding because we've been cut so much, the other thing that we need is actually policy change, because there are some national policies that push people into crisis in the first place. So if you look at homelessness, rough sleeping increasing by 167% between 2010 and 2017, that's not all because of money, that's because of political decision making. So I would like them to look at homelessness and prevention cross departments, and not just saying that's a housing issue, because actually there are other things that connect to it that makes homelessness become almost the byproduct of other social and economical factors of inequalities that people face in society.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's unpack that a bit, Sharon. What policies would you target first of all, or off the bat?
So I think one of the things that we need to target is definitely around welfare reform. So that's a huge factor. So I think that's something that we constantly need to look at. I think, you know, the fact that, I mean, we're seeing it now because we're absolutely in COVID-19. So you can see inequalities and the impact that's having on local people. I think local authorities are ultimately struggling because of housing policy. So we need to build more, because we've seen far too many children in this country who are currently living or staying without a permanent address. So we've almost created a bubble of no move on. So I think we need to address that. And then you have other things that we need to take into consideration. Now, some of them are uncomfortable conversations to have, and they might be around migration. So we've seen at the moment, the government said everyone in, and they said, we won't change the legislation, but bring those in with no recourse to public funds. But that ultimately means those people that we've brought in, actually, you know, it made a huge impact of the numbers. So they need to start considering what we do to support those people whilst we're trying to sort out their status or other things. So I think that's another part of it. You cannot run away from employment and skills and the economic factors, because that also has a huge impact on local communities. And I think in terms of the localism agenda, they also need to start considering about powers that are drifted down towards local decision making, so that we can actually start to unpack how we do things, because gone are the times when local authorities could do everything. We're not in that space anymore. We've shrunk massively, and we need to enable other parts of the sector, enable to step forward and be a part of the jigsaw puzzle, ultimately, of fixing wider social issues. So I think there's something around planning, there's definitely something around house building. You cannot miss out the skills agenda and what we're doing. So if you think the number of young people, for instance, who may become homeless in their lifetime, they go into a homeless accommodation and then they're caught in a catch-22 where the rents are so expensive that actually there's no incentive for them to work. So they're almost stuck in this awful cycle. So I think there's a whole cross-net of cross-cutting policies that are mishmashed at the moment that we forget about in the wider conversation about the housing needs of people living in today's society.
And when you talked about sort of more powers for local authorities, if you could have one enhancement of a local authority power or one new power to help you achieve your ambitions, what would it be?
So what I'll go to first is I'll say at the moment we're seeing huge issues around exempt accommodation. Now, exempt accommodation, we're trying to provide the best housing market within the city, and we've brought in Article 4, which is around the planning approvals, but actually exempt accommodation is exempt from Article 4. You then start looking at, well, actually, we might need to do selective licensing within the city to help us stabilise the quality of the private rented sector, because we acknowledge that in Birmingham, 60% of our housing rental market sits there, but actually exempt accommodation sits outside of selective licensing. So you almost create a situation where if we bring in measures to stabilise other parts of the market, some people sat in that market start to look in other places as lucrative places to start to start, you know, in their housing journey. So ultimately then, you then create more of a funnel towards another area, and that area we've got no powers on. So we've only got powers around agreeing exempts based on the housing benefit criteria, but the legislation actually says that those new providers just need to prove to us that they're providing above minimum levels of support. Well, what does that mean? That's so woolly within itself. So that's just an example of one part of the housing market that actually, if the government gave us more powers on, we could unpack a lot of things, because the social housing regulator, which is a government agency, are doing what they can, but they will tell you that they're short on resources too. So they're kind of acting, I'm not saying that they're reactive, but they are not based within the city with local intelligence. A council is more equipped to determine some of this stuff because we understand our cities.
Absolutely. And then finally, the financial model. How would you want that to be changed, and what would you do with it if you got that?
So okay, so the financial modelling around building social housing, I find that the biggest difficulty is on one hand you have right to buy receipts, and we know that with right to buy receipts, in order to plough them into a housing development, the right to buy receipt ultimately has a lifespan on it. You know, there's a certain time frame that you've got to utilise the right to buy receipt. You've also got the fact that you can't then mix the right to buy receipt with other elements of maybe Homes England funding. So it makes it, not saying it makes it difficult, but when you're looking at a housing scheme, like we have many in Birmingham, you're looking at building housing schemes, and then you automatically have a little bit of a shortfall from either the right to buy receipt isn't going to cover the whole scheme, or the grant is not going to cover the whole scheme. So then you have to have the mixed tenure, which you don't have a problem of having a mixed tenure between social housing and private properties or properties for sale or market value, because I don't believe in ghettoisation. So I wouldn't want just a whole estate of one type of housing. But actually, I would like to have more flexibility and be able to better determine how many of those properties are going to be social housing, and how many of those properties are going to be private rented sector. In addition to that, you then start to look at what is the housing needs. Well, in Birmingham, one of my biggest problems is I need more larger properties. So we've got families who've been in temporary accommodation for a very long period of time because we have got a shortage of 4 and 5 and 6 bedroom properties. Well, actually, if you're trying to build council properties of the size of 4, 5 and 6 bedrooms, the cost mechanism on the overall scheme makes it very difficult. So I would like them to enable us to mix some of the finances, so we can use the grant with the right to buy receipt, to also think around the lifespan of the actual the right to buy receipt, and also enable local councils, because we know, you know, we talk about Section 106 and things like that, and still, but I would like to be able to give local people more say of what we can do within that area, because I don't like to just think of housing as properties. I like to think of it in a position of place. So we need to give people more of a say, because I don't want to create just housing estates. We want to create neighbourhoods that people want to flourish and live in.
So would you be using housing funding for not specifically building housing?
I would like to, I mean, we'd have to use it for building housing, but I think we just need to have, I just think the financial model needs to make it more easier to do other things. So for instance, there's a big argument, not argument, but there's a big thing at the moment around climate change. Well, actually, when I think of our financial model, if I want to build more if we want to build zero carbon properties to make it more carbon neutral, that's going to cost more on the scheme.
Yeah.
But then are you having more carbon neutral properties and less social housing, which then creates, it's answering one question, but it's not sorting out another issue. So I think we would like to have that flexibility, but also for local communities, when we have developers come in, that they can actually direct the developers and say, actually, as a social responsibility, we want you to look at this, this, and this in that local community. At the moment, it's difficult for us to look at it from a point of place. So for instance, you know, when you're building a housing scheme, it's not just about the houses, it's about the roads and the infrastructure. It's about where they are in terms of the schools, and there's wider conversations around that. So I just think we need more flexibility and more scope to explore. Actually, we're not just looking at a housing estate, we are looking at a place and a neighbourhood where people want to live and flourish.